Hi everyone, my name is Leslie Ellen Blood, and today we're going to be talking about imposter syndrome. So, my expertise is in behavior modeling, modification, prediction, and I'm an academic, and I definitely have, let's say, flirted with imposter syndrome throughout the years. So what exactly is imposter syndrome? We're going to chat about that today. We'll talk about predispositions. We'll talk about what I think the most important part is this chronic versus systemic imposter syndrome, feelings of imposter syndrome, doubt, isolation, and achievement. So like, how do you know you're successful? Internal and external identity formation. And finally, reflection and resiliency. So today, by the end of this session, I hope that you're able to define imposter syndrome, which is kind of like tricky and weird, but we'll get into some of those things. We'll be able to identify some of the feelings and symptoms of imposter syndrome. But I also, within that, want you to be able to identify when something is imposter syndrome versus just self-doubt. Self-awareness. Really important. So self-awareness and understanding what triggers can make you feel, for example, like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be here. So making you feel like you might be an imposter. We're going to talk a little bit about some strategies to overcome that. We're going to talk a little bit too about resiliency in imposter syndrome, because obviously imposter syndrome can really hurt your academic resiliency. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the intrinsic doubt, like some of the historical doubts that we have about our abilities, and talk a little bit about, when something like that is internal and then you have an external environment that maybe reinforces those, what you can do to improve that. Out of all of the talks that I give, I would say that imposter syndrome, we have more people sign up for imposter syndrome talks than most things on campus. Why is that? Is it because imposter syndrome sounds like a fun time? No, it's not. It's because most academics can relate to imposter syndrome. They feel like they may have imposter syndrome, and they want to figure out how to fix that. They want someone outside of themselves. They want to come to an imposter syndrome talk, and they want someone to tell them, like, no, man, you're good. You're not an imposter. But it's way more complex than that. So imposter syndrome is popular because, and I think it's especially popular in academia, because academia in and of itself, it puts most of us in a position where it's the first time maybe you've done original research. It might be the first time you've published a bunch of your work. It also might be the first time that you're having, some of the work that you've done peer reviewed, which can be pretty stressful at the beginning. You're also now in a room with millions of brilliant people. It's not, you're naturally in an environment where you're hyper aware of where you are, what you're contributing, and what the feedback has been. I think the other thing, with imposter syndrome, especially in academia, is because we see so much of it because there's no real arrival, right? And by that I mean, I started my PhD started in 2004 and I finished in 2007. And I remember thinking throughout the process that at some point I would feel like, I was an expert in my field, right? Because that's what we're taught. You will become an expert in your field. And then, to be honest, I never really felt like I was. I cared a lot about the work that I was doing. I wanted to contribute something valuable. And at the same time, because it's the first time I was doing original research, I wasn't really sure what the impact of that was going to be. So there's a lot of this kind of loosey-goosey feeling of am I doing a good job or am I not? And I thought as soon as they said, congratulations, doctor, I'd feel like I was an expert in my field, right? Because you're sitting in front of your committee, they've decided you are deserving of this degree. And I thought that'll be the thing. That'll be the thing that makes me feel like I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and I belong. No. I felt weird. I felt like, oh God, if I can do this, then Well, everyone can, so it must not even be that special. So I thought, well, maybe I'll feel successful when I get a tenure track job. Nope. I get a tenure track job, and the whole entire time I'm nervous. I was 27 or 28. Everybody knew more than me. They were smarter than me, better than me, had published more than me. I was in this situation where I was like, any day they're going to realize that they hired a complete idiot, which is not true, mind you, but that's how it felt. And I was waiting to feel the success, the arrival. So I was like, tenure. When I get tenure, I'll feel it. Nope. Still didn't feel it then. And I want to point this out because I think in academia in general, it's this weird dynamic of like, we know that research is collaborative, right? Like we know our work is building on someone else's work. And at the same time, academia can also be very isolating when you're doing original research, right? Because you're having to find a hole, figure out, how to answer some of those questions and make that your career, right? So it's this weird, pulled in different directions, and it's just hard to conceptualize, like, how do I know I'm doing a good job? How do I know I'm any good at any of this or not? I would also want to point out to you, especially in academia, that most professors that I have had in the past have not been great about discussing what it took to actually get to the place where they are. So when you see someone, tenured professor, you see a history of success, right? You're like, well, yeah, of course. I mean, they have tenure, this is brilliant, all this stuff. But what you don't hear about are all of the hurdles and challenges and things you have to go through in order to get to that point. And so we definitely need in academia way more transparency around this journey. It would do a lot to help people feel like they do belong. But, hopefully we're moving in that direction. But until things fully change, I want to bring that to your attention because let's face it, there's not a lot of transparency around other people's academic journeys. Many of us in academia feel like maybe we got into a program accidentally, right? Like, maybe they thought that I was smart enough to do this thing, but now that I'm here and it's actually the first thing I've done that's really, really hard, maybe I don't belong. And so there's just this constant questioning and trying to figure out, am I smart enough? Am I good enough? Can I do this, right? And those questions oftentimes are confused for chronic imposter syndrome. And we're going to talk about some of those things today. So when we think about imposter syndrome, right? Well, first of all, I think that we all can we have a definition we agree on? So it's just chronic feelings of self-doubt, lack of belonging. It's definitely like a very isolating issue for most of us, feeling like our work doesn't measure up, feeling like if anyone were to find out what we really knew, that they would fire us or they wouldn't want to work with us. So basically, this mask, right? The imposter syndrome mask is when you're showing up and you think you're pretending to be the brilliant academic that you are. But everyone else is the brilliant academic, but you're pretending. So if you've ever experienced that, sure, those are feelings of imposter syndrome. What drives those tends to be perfectionism. So for example, if you've always been a super high achiever, you go and you start grad school and I don't know, let's say you get your first A-. You don't belong. Or let's say you get your first B for that matter. Oh my God, I don't belong here. I shouldn't be here. I've never gotten a bad grade before. So when something is new, right, and by the way, this is completely normal. It's about risk assessment. It's biological. You're looking around and you're trying to figure out, should I be with this group of people or not? And so perfectionism is, I don't want to make any mistakes so that everyone can see that I belong. You hold yourself to impossibly high standards, which of course you cannot meet. And then you're disappointed. So perfectionism definitely can trigger feelings of imposter syndrome. High external expectations. If your history is, let's say you grew up in a family where your guardians demanded straight A's, a perfectly clean room. Let's say nothing you ever did was good enough, right? So those impossibly high standards can then set you up for a predisposition to feeling like, you're not good enough and you don't belong. Internal expectations. So having really high internal expectations. So if you really expect a lot from yourself, and sometimes, let's face it, those expectations might not be realistic, especially when you're starting a PhD program you may not know very much about, right? It's a learning process. What can you expect? But if you go in holding yourself to impossibly high standards, the chances that you're going to be disappointed are, high. Competitive environments. This is a tricky one, right? And this is what I was saying. This is the confusing piece with academia. It's like research is at its very core collaborative, and yet here you are feeling very isolated. And so sometimes in academia, especially when we're struggling, or if let's say you're deep in dissertation writing mode and you're not seeing people very often, you kind of lose touch with reality. I know that I struggled with that when I was writing my dissertation. I had a new baby at the time as well. And so I was just home alone writing my dissertation with my son, wearing old sorority t-shirts, not talking to any adults whatsoever, mostly for months at a time. And that isolation did make me wonder what my contribution would actually be. So that's another precursor. So feeling like, you're alone. Gender representation. So we could spend hours talking about this, but in academia, when you look around, right, you're looking around a room. Do you see people like you? We say so many things about recruitment, retention, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's getting better, right? We are getting better, but we have a long way to go. And so if you're a minority, if you're a woman, if there is in your area, when you look around, a lack of people like you, so you don't see that representation, yes, you're more predisposed to feeling like, maybe I don't belong. That's imposter syndrome, right? Lack of feedback. So this is an interesting thing in academia. I know that for myself and most of my students, there is no shortage, and there was no shortage for me of, critical feedback. And that's not to say that critical feedback is bad. I mean, it's necessary if you want to improve your research, but there wasn't a lot of positive feedback. There wasn't a lot of like, oh, hey, you're doing a really great job. High five, nice work on comps. There's not a lot of like celebrating these little milestones. And so you kind of lose touch with exactly what's going on here. You're like, is this good? Am I doing things right? Or is everything I'm doing not good enough, wrong? Are there, all these edits, corrections? It's exhausting, and it can feel sometimes very defeating, especially when you're working your butt off to, have your original research be as great as it can be. And then last but not least, mental health. So we mentioned isolation a bit, and isolation is a big problem in grad school. So is depression and anxiety, which tend up getting much worse when there's a lot of isolation. And so, if you're experiencing high levels of anxiety, if you do tend to pull back and you're spending a lot of time alone. But yes, any historical mental health challenges that you might have encountered around depression and anxiety can also predispose you to feeling like an imposter. Now, this is the new piece, I hope, at least for some of you. I don't teach imposter syndrome workshops like I used to anymore because I don't think the problem is you. I don't think the problem is me most of the time. So right now we're going to talk about the difference between systemic and chronic imposter syndrome. Chronic imposter syndrome is me coming into school, always having had a lot of doubt, not sure of my abilities, probably with some history of mental health challenges. But the chronic piece is that it's not new, right? Those feelings of doubt are not new. Chronic imposter syndrome also, and this is very important to understand, if you have chronic imposter syndrome, it's crippling. So it's one thing to feel nervous and to question belonging. It's another thing to not be able to turn in an article, not be able to present at a conference, because you're not just nervous, you're incapacitated by the doubt. And those are two different things. Chronic, there's a history. There are reasons why you're feeling that way. Systemic is something quite a bit different. I think most of us, when we walk into those huge auditoriums full of people listening to talks on imposter syndrome, most of us are not dealing with actual imposter syndrome. We're in an environment where systemic imposter syndrome has made you doubt your abilities. But that's not you not believing that you're capable, and it's certainly not you not being capable. It's that you are in an environment that makes you feel like maybe you aren't, for a million different reasons. So chronic, internal; systemic, external. When you have a history of chronic self-doubt, you'll probably be able to trace many moments where you have felt like you do not belong somewhere, or that you've been faking it till you make it for many years. But the difference between having chronic imposter syndrome and just, being stressed and worried about your performance is that chronic imposter syndrome will prevent you from doing the things you actually need to do to get your degree. Most of us don't think about it that way. Systemic, though, systemic imposter syndrome is the environment that we're in. So I've mentioned to you guys already a bunch of different reasons why you might feel a lot of doubt as an academic. I think that anytime you're really invested in an outcome, feeling nervous, feeling scared, and having doubt is normal. We need to normalize those feelings in academia. When I get up to present now, and mind you, I've had my PhD since 2007. It's almost 20 years. When I get up to present now, I still feel nervous. If I'm ever paid to show up and talk somewhere, I'm like, oh my God, what are these people doing? I don't know anything. I still have those feelings. I know they're not true, but it's because I really want to show up and do a good job. Of course I'm nervous. Of course I care about my performance. And so you feeling nervous and feeling not sure you're going to do a good job, or not even sure, like, oh, maybe I won't be able to finish this thing. It's really hard. All of that's completely normal. You're not going to be sure. You're not going to be sure because you've never done it before. And so having some clarity around whether or not what you're experiencing is some long-term historical feelings of imposter syndrome versus you being now in an environment that encourages feelings of imposter syndrome, two very different things. So now we're going to move into an activity. I think that one of the helpful things you can do to figure out whether or not something is truly imposter syndrome or whether it's just, doubt, is to examine different areas of your life where you do feel like an imposter, okay? So while I do not believe I have imposter syndrome, and I've never felt incredibly uncomfortable in academia, I will say that I've had moments for sure when I'm very invested in something and not sure what the outcome's going to be. And so being able to identify areas outside of academia where doubt might live and what's triggered it can be helpful. So for those of us that have, let's say we grew up in a household where, the demands were really high and we felt like we were never good enough. We felt like we could never be perfect enough, right? All of those things. Like, there's something there. Like, that would have been, when did imposter syndrome begin? Well, when I was really young and felt like I wasn't good enough, versus, let's say, you're valedictorian, you're crushing school, you get to grad school, and now that you're around a bunch of other people who are just as smart as you, that's when it's kicking in, right? So they're two different things. Is it self-doubt, or is it the feeling of you do not belong in this space and you cannot do the things? Crippling. Next question is, when's the last time you did something really difficult? So one of the easiest ways to, I hate saying cure, but we're going to use it, cure imposter syndrome, is to look at other areas of your life where you have been very successful. You have a history of success. You can do hard things, right? So that helps sort of break out this isolation piece. So we want to ask, once again, what areas of our lives do we feel like, oh God, imposter syndrome in? And then what are areas of our lives where we feel like we've had a significant history of success, where we are doing hard things? Think about skills you have, something you're really good at that not a lot of people are. Now, what this can do is sort of jumpstart a shift in perspective, right? So maybe I'm not sure that I'm the smartest academic in my field ever. Maybe I'm not even sure I'm an expert, right? But if I look outside and I can see myself achieving really wonderful things in other areas of my life, chances are that confidence that's existing outside of academia will transfer inside. So, historical, and then when we're experiencing it, and when we're also feeling like, hey, this is a really special skill, I'm really good at this. So being able to identify those is a great start.